It's wonderful to be with you all and to be back at Yale. We've got a larger group this time, but having read some of the CVs of people, I'm obviously in the presence of an immense amount of accumulated experience as well as intelligence. So it's a real honor and pleasure for me to come and lecture you and take these classes over the coming weeks. As Martha said to me, I'm now dressed like a member of the Yale faculty. I haven't yet acquired the mental skills to go with it, but we're working on that. See, one of the things, when I was just thinking of the last bit you were saying there about Gregory Clark and wealth not bringing happiness, he thinks that we're as the hunter-gatherers were as happy as we are. Not sure about that. It reminds me that there's a friend of mine who's really, really wealthy guy, a philanthropist. And he went, as part of his philanthropic duties, he went and lectured in the third world. And he was lecturing a class a bit like this of students obviously very poor. And gave them this line about how wealth really didn't make for happiness, and they should understand that. And he could speak like that because as a wealthy person. And one of the students came up to him afterwards and said, look, your wealth is obviously distressing you a lot here. If you were to give me your wealth, I would relieve you of the burden of that distress. So I'm a little, surprisingly enough, he didn't take him up on the offer. So I'm not sure about that. But now, what I wanted to do is to give an introduction as to, really in a sense, why this course. I mean, we know that faith, contrary to what people believed some time ago, faith is growing, not diminishing. So that whole sweep of European and Western intellectual thought that said as we develop, so faith will fall away and we will be liberated from the dogmas and mysticism and foolishness of religion. We know that that has not in fact happened. Right? Faith is growing, not diminishing. And we also know that globalization is here with us, is an unstoppable force, and is in a sense defining the world in which we live, both in terms of economy and lifestyle and communication and so on. The question is, why put them together, really? I mean, why say, let's study faith and globalization? I mean, okay, both are clearly acknowledged aspects of the world today, but why do we examine them together? And the reason for that, and this partnership with Yale and now with other universities in the world arose out of my foundation, which is about religious interfaith and how we get better understanding between people of different faiths in the world. The reason I put these two subjects together is that I think the key aspect or the key characteristic of globalization is that it is pushing the world together. I mean, I often say to people, when I was growing up as a young boy in the northeast of England, a place called Durham, I actually remember the day I met my first non-white person. I was 12 years old. I lived in a very, very restricted little environment. My community was my community. The lady that used to come in and help my mum with various things in the house had never been outside County Durham in all the 60 years of her life. And I think when she died, she'd probably never been outside this little space, right? That was the world that I grew up in. I never really, actually one of my best friends when I was growing up was in fact Jewish. I never even asked him about his faith. I just assumed everyone was Christian. Right? So that's the world that used to be. My children today have at least 3 different faiths amongst their friends. Right, my little 10-year-old, never mind my older ones who are obviously in the workplace in London with lots of different people from lots of different faiths. So globalization is pushing the world together. And the question really is because religion is growing, and I think growing, as I'll come to in a moment, for reasons in some sense connected with globalization actually. As globalization pushes people together, will religious faith become a force that pulls them apart again? And that's why the two things coming together are so important. And if we understand the role of faith in the world, if we understand different faiths and cultures better, then we have a chance both to make faith a source of progress in an era of globalization, since, as I will say in a moment, I think that faith can play a very positive role in the era of globalization, and we are more likely to reduce the possibility of faith being used as a source of conflict. So this relationship between faith and globalization is, I think, at the heart of what makes the world tick today. And as I often say to people, I think the 20th century was a century dominated by fundamental political ideology, but I don't think the 21st century will be dominated in the same way by political ideology. I think it could well be dominated, however, by religious or cultural ideology. Now, you can work out sometimes, and there's a great debate about what's really religion, what's really politics, but you know what I mean. In other words, a traditional battle between left and right over the market, capitalism versus socialism, I think is going to, that battle will still remain, but within far narrower parameters. However, the prospects of different cultural, religious forces pulling the world apart is very much present and with us, and an active risk in our world today. And I think when we come to look at the issue of faith, faith really operates in two different aspects for people. One is faith as my identity, right? I am a Christian. That is not necessarily in opposition to you as a Muslim or a Hindu or a Jew or whatever, but it is faith as an identity with a set of doctrines, with a set of religious instructions that go with it, that are applicable simply to that faith. So that is faith, as I will call it, faith as identity. But faith also plays a different role, which is faith as values. Faith as the values that motivate people, that give them purpose in their lives, that try and make them better people, that give rise to the human flourishing that Miroslav's just been talking about. So faith is about what you are, but it's also about what you do, what it means in your life. And faith, of course, makes certain truth claims. Right? Each faith will make its own truth claims. And to that extent, of course, faith is exclusive, right? Since the truth claims are different in all the major different faiths. But you can have faith that makes truth claims that are exclusive to that faith without necessarily using those truth claims as a badge of opposition or maybe exclusivism. In other words, you start to define yourself as with your truth claims in opposition to those who have different truth claims. So what I mean by that is that faith necessarily has the characteristic, if you are of someone of a faith, right, I am a Muslim, I have a view about the importance of the Quran, which a Christian or a Jew does not, right? That is a truth claim about the Quran. Right? That is distinctive, and in one sense it is obviously exclusive. But it does not necessarily follow from that you then regard yourself as in opposition to others. So I think, although faith is necessarily a badge of identity, and in one sense exclusive identity, it doesn't necessarily mean that that identity has to be in opposition to others, but there is a risk of that, let us say. So faith has this notion of identity in it, but it also has this notion of values. And as we'll see in a moment, when it comes to values, then sometimes faith can have a commonality, which in terms of identity, it plainly doesn't. The other thing about faith, very obviously, is faith in today's world is seen as a force for conflict, as a source of division, but it can also be a force for good. I mean, it's a statement of the obvious. But those two aspects of faith are very dramatically there with us. And indeed, I would say that just at the same time as faith itself and people of faith are growing, there is also probably a reaction against that. In fact, you can see this, a secular reaction against that, from people who say, hey, you guys are actually the problem in the world. So I'm against faith. I mean, rather curiously for me as a Christian, I was brought up, my dad who was in fact, and is in fact, a militant atheist. And his view of it is, look back in history, all these clerics are crazy people, they cause nothing but harm. So I'm a rationalist, I'm a humanist, and don't tell me about faith, I don't want to know about it. It's all that does is look at the wars in the world that have been caused by it. Now, I then have a big debate about it and say, actually, look at what political ideology did in the 20th century, so on. You can have this debate, but faith is seen by people today as with this contradictory aspect. On the one hand, it can be a source when you see the work that relief organizations, Islamic relief, Jewish relief, or the Christian relief organizations do in some of the poorest parts of the world. It's a magnificent demonstration of faith. And then you have the fundamentalism or the extremism, which is obviously faith in its worst aspect. So that was what is happening in the world of faith. Those are maybe the characteristics that we can identify today, with faith in its place in the modern world, occupying a larger place in our lives, I think, than maybe 15, 20 years ago. And the interaction with globalization is absolutely central because of the way that globalization operates. So let's just examine globalization for a minute. This globalization, this sort of G-force. I think when you analyze globalization, there are certain things that are necessary to say about it. Sometimes the idea is that globalization is essentially a policy of governments. I don't actually think this is true, having been in government. I think globalization is driven essentially by people. So people getting access to technology and to travel and to mass communication, this is what is fueling globalization. And frankly, there's not much governments can do to stop that happening, because the technology and the science is driving people to be able to do far more across national boundaries than they ever did before. So globalization, to my mind, is a force driven by people, and it is, by the way, positive in many of its aspects. I mean, where I disagree with some of what is written, and even that you've been reading for this lecture on globalization, is, if you take a country like China and you see the fact that they've lifted hundreds of millions of people out of poverty in the last 20 years, that was as a direct consequence of the opening up policy. Right? If China hadn't opened up, China would not be in the situation it is today. So when that decision was taken in the 1970s to open China up, the result of it was that they were able then dramatically to increase the living standards of their people. Same with India. When actually the present Indian Prime Minister, Manmohan Singh, was finance minister back in the early 90s and began the process of liberalizing the Indian economy, not vastly far, but further than it had been before, it definitely brought prosperity for people. Whatever the problems of the European Union right now, the fact is the single market, you can see this very clearly, has actually engineered huge amount of growth and opportunity for people. I would even say, in respect of Africa, that though you can make arguments about how globalization has exploited Africa, I actually think that it's less globalization that has exploited Africa than the combination of globalization and bad governance. And actually, I think that if you bring decent governance to Africa combined with globalization, it would in fact open up opportunity there as well. But that's a debate you can have. But the point is, I think what is virtually undebatable is that globalization, at least in certain aspects, has had a positive impact. But there are negatives. There are negatives because, as Miroslav was just saying, in areas like the environment, globalization can be blind to the consequences of its force. There are negatives because people become aware of difference far more today. I mean, one of the things that this era of technology and mass communication does is make people aware of the injustices and the inequalities. If you look at the financial crisis, you can argue about the causes of it, but you can say, perfectly justifiably, that one element of it, at least, was a failure to regulate sufficiently the process of globalization in the financial sector, or at least to understand it and to supervise it adequately. And the case that I would make is that globalization, with its positive and its negative aspects, when you then take a step back and say, well, how do you bring out the positive and diminish the negative, I think you necessarily reach for a set of values to do that. So the issue then becomes not whether you try and stop globalization, but how do you shape it? How do you spread its benefits? How, in other words, do you put some human decision-making into what is otherwise potentially an impersonal economic, social force that carries people wherever it will carry them? Right? So most people, I think, today, even if they're on the side of globalization is a positive, recognize that globalization also needs to be informed by certain values. Not just for it to be fair, incidentally, although it being fair is important, but I would even argue for it to work. So I think globalization without rules, without values, probably is not merely a globalization that will lead to an acute sense of injustice in those that are left behind by it, but also it will snarl up. It will fail to function effectively at certain critical challenge points. So what we have is a situation where globalization as a force unsettles because it moves fast and with seeming indifference to its effect on people. But it is nonetheless something that is a force that is driven by people and is opening the world up and is going to carry on. So the question then becomes, well, given that that is how globalization is, can faith provide the values that shape this globalization in a benign way? And the truth is it can or it can't, because it can if faith is about values, and values that, as it were, people can share to an extent at least in common across faiths, and so come to some sort of agreement about the moral imperatives that should govern our attitude to globalization. And faith can't provide that unifying and healthy role if faith, in fact, operates as a counterforce to globalization and actually ends up with people believing that as globalization pushes people together, they've actually got to stand up for their religion as a badge of identity in resisting this force and denying it. Now, that reaction against globalization happening in the world of faith is very clear. You can see it here in America. You can see it in virtually any European country you care to mention at the moment. I mean, it pops up in immigration debates, very noticeably. It pops up in debates over, as we can see, the whole Ground Zero issue in New York. France, where there's just been a major debate. And actually, virtually anywhere in Europe today, you could fight and possibly, and sadly, even win an election pretty much on a, our way of life is under threat from, then pick your class of people that you want to identify as the other. And that is where, the two aspects of faith as identity, faith as values, are very, very important to get right. Because when we talk about faith growing in the world, faith is growing, the numbers of people connected to the faith community are growing, but some of those are becoming more what I would call, I know it could be misconstrued this as a term, but what I would call more fundamentalist. And they tend often to see globalization as a threat to their faith, and in a sense their fundamentalism becomes a reaction to that globalization. And so, for example, one of the interesting aspects of globalization and of modern business is if you want to succeed in modern business today, you have to develop your human capital. And in an era of globalization, discrimination on the grounds of your gender or your faith or your race actually becomes an inhibiting factor for the success of your business. So the most successful businesses I know, any of them operating at a global level, are operating on the basis of equality, not because they think it's simply some great moral cause, but because actually otherwise you're wasting the human capital, you're not accessing the potential of your workforce. Now, sometimes the very fundamentalism that comes into religious faith is precisely set in opposition to that whole notion of people coming together, of equality. And there is a battle within each major religion at the moment. I mean, we think about it very much in terms of Islam, but actually the same battle is going on in Christianity. Most of my time I spend now out in the Middle East. In my office in Jerusalem, which is just on the borderline between East and West Jerusalem, you look out of one window and you will see very Orthodox Jews in the very Orthodox costume. You look out of the other side, literally the other side of the room, facing the eastern direction, and you will tend to see women and indeed men in very traditional Islamic dress. So this idea, if you like, of religion growing, and by the way, both groups will tell you in Jerusalem, those who were brought up, Jews or Muslims, will tell you that Jerusalem is an infinitely more religious, and fundamentally so, more religious place than it was 15 or 20 years ago, which is interesting in itself. That fundamentalism is growing. Right? Now, at the other side, part of what is driving the growth in numbers of people of religious faith is actually a search for spirituality, which is slightly different. So what is interesting in the UK, whenever we poll people on religion, is the numbers of people who go to church now in the UK. I mean, I think in America the figure's still over 50%, isn't it, who go to church or go to some form of worship every week. In the UK, I think it's down to about 10% who go to church, so it's not a great deal. But you pose the question, do you believe in God? The figures go right up, back over 60, 70% and more. So I think the other thing that's happening in the growth of religion is actually a search for spirituality, which is precisely not a reaction against globalization, but a desire to put alongside globalization some sense that life is more than simply about material circumstances or material wealth. Right? So these two things together are creating a greater movement towards religious faith. And what we're finding is an analysis of faith today is part theology, part sociology, part politics, and possibly even part economics. Now, given therefore that globalization is as positive as its negatives, that faith has also these two aspects to its development today, how then, when we link the two together, do we get faith to play a positive part? And I would offer these points very briefly to you. And I've made 7 of them, because that's kind of biblical. No, I don't mean that. How do we make faith a positive in this era of globalization? One, whilst each faith has its exclusive truth claims, we define a space of common values. And that is actually very easy to do, because the basic principle, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, is actually found in all of the key religious faiths. Actually, when I was in China recently, Confucius said the same. Right? So it's a very, very universal principle. And there are common aims of social justice, a belief in enhancing the opportunities of others, which faiths can share in common. So even though they have their exclusive truth claims, we should try to develop between the faiths this common space of shared values. In fact, one of the things that you'll see in the course of this is there is a program actually specifically between Muslims and Christians called the Common Word, which is actually to try and provide the theological basis for such a common space, at least between Christians and Muslims, but frankly could apply to Jews, Hindus, Buddhists, Sikhs, and so on. The second thing is to have a debate arising out of which it would be good to get clarity about what is the proper public role of faith groups in the political life of a country. Now, my view in the end is that the proper place is a right to speak and to be heard, but not a right to dictate. Now, I just offer you that, but it's, other people may have different views. But I think, I face this as Prime Minister in the UK because I'm someone of religious faith. I'm a Catholic, but I took positions on certain issues, gay rights probably being the most obvious of them, which were contrary to that of the Catholic Church. One of the hardest things I had to do, and it just shows you how this is a very, very difficult area where there were adoption agencies for children from very disadvantaged backgrounds in the UK, right? So there are agencies, and many of them are religious in nature, who help children from abusive backgrounds. They take them in and they find parents to adopt them. So it's a great service. It's a very, very important service. The Catholic adoption agencies, when the change of the law came in so that there was equality between gay people and non-gay people, the Catholic adoption agency said, look, we're not going to adopt for gay parents. We're just not going to do it. And it was just one of these interesting things, because I'd always taken a very pro-gay rights position. On the other hand, people were asking me to shut down these Catholic adoption agencies who were doing the most fantastic work, but they didn't share that position on gay. So, now in the end I found a way through it, but it was one of these situations where you got attacked from all sides. Some people didn't like your position on gay rights. Some people said, well, if that's your position, then you should be forcing the Catholics to do it, and I wanted to try and find a way through it. Now, the Catholic Church throughout that, they could get pretty heavy. The notices were going up in the church. And my attitude was very, very simple with them, which is you've got an absolute right to speak and to be heard, but I am the Prime Minister. So, and that incidentally was not because I wanted to say my position is definitively right and your position's wrong. It could have been the other way around. But in the end, I wanted to define that role in the faith group in the public space. Because, of course, then you get a whole lot of other people with other positions. And then it can become quite difficult to govern. But I use that as an illustration of the fact that the second point that I would make is faith to be a positive. We need to have that debate and define it and try and get as much clarity as we can about what is the proper role of faith in the public space. The third thing is something very basic, which is what my Faith Foundation tries to do with its schools program. But we should actually have active programs as society. It doesn't have to be run by government, incidentally, to understand the other. When I was here a few days ago and someone asked me about burning the Quran, I said, actually, why don't you read it? Because it's interesting to read. It's fascinating for me as a Christian to study the Quran. I now, when I read about other religions, it actually helps inform enormously my view of other cultures. So, for example, I actually don't think you can understand China today unless you don't simply read the political speeches, but you actually go back and read those philosophers that have very much given rise to the Chinese personality and the character and the way people think. Right? So, programs of understanding is the third thing that the faith community needs, and they need to be involved in that without feeling it threatens their own faith. And believe it or not, in our experience, the more people know about another faith, it doesn't actually dislodge their own faith, but it enriches it. Certainly, I've found that, and I think others can too. The fourth thing is, we should all, as people of faith, if we believe in God, acknowledge our limitations of God's purpose and will and knowledge. In other words, there's a rabbi who said to me, who's very much involved in the interfaith, and the toughest question you always get asked is this. And I remember doing a panel at Davos in the International Forum, and I had 4 clerics and me, right? So felt very holy. There was a rabbi, a rabbi and the Grand Mufti of Bosnia, and there was Chief Rabbi, the Grand Mufti of Bosnia. There was a Buddhist, and then there was a cleric actually from America, an evangelical. And we had an interfaith discussion. It was a great discussion. And at the end of it, I was feeling it'd just been a little too, getting on with each other all too well, really. I said to them, so tell me, do you believe that your faith is the only true path to salvation? And it was a fascinating thing, you see, because the audience actually quite wanted to know the answer to that. The clerics, of course, all started behaving like politicians, which really was probably sensible in the end. And it is difficult, this, very, very difficult, because, if you are a Christian, you have certain beliefs, right? And they are different from the other person's beliefs. You can't expel that from your mind. But if you at least acknowledge the limitations of your knowledge of God's will, it gives you that little bit of humility that can lead to a lot of respect for others despite the difference. The fifth thing rather is, if we want faith to be a positive, then we have to use the ability of faith to mobilize human activity for purposes that are for the human good. In other words, one of the things that my foundation does is about the anti-malaria campaign of the United Nations, and we try to get people of different faiths involved, both in spreading the word in the developed nations about how important this is, and then out in Africa, getting particularly the churches and the mosques as distribution centers for the bed nets for malaria and so on. But the point is, what you're trying to do is to emphasize and augment that dimension of faith that is about the good of humanity. And one of the things that faith groups have is this incredible mobilizing power. Right? Well, we should use that mobilizing power for the common good. That is one major way that faiths, because sometimes faiths find it easier to work together on programs of action than they do to discuss issues of theology. Because programs of action can unite, issues of theology can often divide. The sixth thing is that, and this is why the academic aspect of this is so important, and why it's not just Yale that has this course today. We've now got roughly, I think, 8 or 9 universities. Will expand it to about 12 or 15 taking this course. One of the things we want to do in the course of all of this is to get people to recognize that religion and religious thought itself is evolving. You know, religions actually don't stand still, in fact. And an analysis and understanding and examination of that process, I think, is also of benefit in making faith as a whole a force for good. Because then, rather than seeing religion as a static set of institutions, beliefs, and practices, we actually comprehend that there is an evolutionary process within religious thought that is continuing all the time. And that evolutionary process, if you read Karen Armstrong's book, The Great Transformation, you see it tracked from very early times. And as you were saying about the axial period, the truth is there was a moment in which suddenly religion became, rather than an often violent and mercurial and inconsistent God whose views nonetheless had to be obeyed, suddenly you got that evolution to an ethical dimension to religion that was actually about a God that was rational and trying to shape the world in a way that was good. So, you know, it's foolish for us sitting here in the 21st century not to notice and to track and to understand that process of evolution. And the final point, the seventh, is this. I think faith is more likely to be a positive if we don't confuse values with policies. I mean, I think this is very, very difficult, because it's difficult particularly in the context of some of the things we've read for this week. You see, I used to, in the G8 in Gleneagles in 2005, I put Africa on the agenda of the G8, and we agreed this program of aid and debt relief and so on. And I saw it was actually remarkable for many things, not least when you're very, very busy as Prime Minister, right? People come in and out of Downing Street the whole time, and you don't always get a proper track of your program for the day, okay? And one of the things that was organized, unbeknownst to me, was because the Church of England allow women priests, right? There was a march of women priests on Downing Street. And they all turned up in Downing Street, about 200 of them dressed with clerical collars. And I thought this was skit or a joke or something. It was so I actually didn't. So I'm going out to greet them. I say, yes, so come on, so where are you from? And they were saying, what do you mean, where are we from? Where? And I said, no, but seriously, who are you? We are women priests, 200 of them. Very formidable, incidentally. Not to be messed around with, anyway. So, you know, I was pretty much polishing shoes by the end of that. So, but the point is this, when I sat them down, we were able to agree on debt relief. We couldn't agree on free trade, right? They thought free trade is a capitalist conspiracy, right? And I was saying to them, no, I don't agree with that, I'm afraid. I actually think African countries they need to break down trade barriers between themselves, first of all, and then actually they need to participate. We can give them access to European markets, but actually it's better for them if they're participating in the global trading framework. And the point I'm making is this. Faith will be more of a positive if we understand what faith can do and what it can't. What faith can do is give you values by which you approach decision making. Unfortunately, it can't tell you what the right decision is. That's policy that's got to be also decided by a rational debate. And believe it or not, people can come to different points of view as to what that means. So, you know, people used to say to me, does faith play a part in your role as Prime Minister? And I used to say, of course, if you're a person of faith, it plays a part. But, you know, I can't go into a corner and pray to God and say, what should the minimum wage be at next year? You know, he didn't tell you the answer. It would be great if he did, but he doesn't. So that's got to be worked out differently. So what that also means is that position of faith in this political space, you know, again has to be defined, you know, carefully. Otherwise, it ceases to be a force for good and becomes actually a force and a source of division. So that is, those are the basic principles which I think, if we apply to the interaction of faith with globalization, can lead to positive outcomes. The final point I conclude on is this, that I think one thing we want to do out of this has been running now this is the third year. And as I say, we're now extending this to other universities who are doing their different notions of this. So we've just concluded an agreement with Peking University, with Monterrey Tech in Mexico, National University of Singapore, McGill, Durham University. We've got 2 or 3 universities in the Middle East we are analyzing now as possible partners. What we want to do in the end is to get to this concept of, you know, religion and its place in the modern world, faith and globalization, as a discipline of an academic nature where we are examining these key issues, doing research on it, publishing material on it, because this issue now, with the greatest deference to the divinity department, one of the reasons we did this, Miroslav and I, first in the way we did it, was to involve more than simply the divinity department, the School of Management, other departments now as well, precisely because this is not, in a way, it's too important an issue now to be simply put in that compartment. And, you know, I think that if we are able to articulate and describe both what this interaction means, what are its trends, what are potential conclusions or talking points for policy, we will do something that is very, very important for shaping policy making, decision making, political leadership in the 21st century.